The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Richard Fontaine.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is the third session in a series on national security at the Sine Institute at American University. I'm Richard Fontaine, a 2022 Sine Institute Fellow and the CEO of the Center for New American Security. This series is titled Crafting National Security for Today and Tomorrow, and it's focused on the chief forces driving today's world and how we should respond to them. Today, we'll talk technology and national security, which of course is only growing in importance and in attention given to it by policymakers. At once upon a time, the kind of tech questions that animated national security discussions turned on things like nuclear weapons and missile throw weights, and especially defense technologies. Now on the table are issues like semiconductors and 5G and AI, quantum computing, blockchain, and maybe the metaverse. So to talk all of this over, I'm very pleased to have my guest and friend, Jared Cohen. Jared is the founder and CEO of Jigsaw, an independent unit at Google that's focused on building technology to address global security challenges. He's also an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to Alphabet, Jared was Google's first Director of Ideas and Chief Advisor to Google's CEO and Executive Chairman Eric Schmidt. He served for 4 years as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as advisor to both Condi Rice and Hillary Clinton. And he's written 5 books on topics ranging from the new digital age to presidential history. He's also a collector of presidential hair, so he has the flowing locks of quite a number of commanders in chief. And he and I have squeezed in some co-authored articles, including one on foreign affairs on uniting the techno-democracies. So I'll kick off the conversation with Jared. Jared, you can go ahead and turn on your video and microphone. And if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. So Jared, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Richard. It's very, I like the sort of timing of turning on the video and the microphone. It brings a lot of drama and excitement to the conversation.
And reality TV, that's known as the reveal, and we had planned that all along. So this is the big reveal. So let me start with a big question that I think kind of parallels your career. So when you were working on tech issues at the State Department more than a decade ago, it was kind of seen as a niche set of issues by, I think, the national security, foreign policy community writ large. I mean, if you stopped folks and asked them the things that they were thinking about, it was the war on terror, Iran, North Korea, things like that. And now everybody wants to talk about the role of technology in national security all the time. You see this even institutionally. There's a newly established Deputy National Security Advisor focused on emerging technologies. A new bureau at the State Department is being established. So what has changed since you first started working in this on this set of issues with respect to technology?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to talk about what's changed and also what has not changed, right? So, when I was first sort of looking at I've been looking at the nexus of technology and international security going back to, really, 2003, 2004. and I stumbled into it by accident. I wasn't interested in technology at all, but I had spent time living in Iran and was there to understand the opposition movements and emerging dissident movements, and I just saw the way in which they were using technology that I thought I understood in completely different ways. So my time in Iran, was kind of I always sort of describe it as my technology origin story, in the sense that on the streets of Iran, specifically in Shiraz, I saw these two stories of innovation playing out. One story of innovation is a story that we're familiar with, where engineers, usually in the developed economies, build technologies to solve one set of problems, typically in their own markets. And as that technology becomes ubiquitous and spreads to the rest of the world, there's a second and arguably more important story of innovation, which is people in other countries with a totally different set of needs and challenges find innovative use cases and applications for that technology that surprise even its creators. And that's a trend that I saw in Iran, and again in 2004, and it's a trend that I continue to see with every type of technology going forward. Now, the things that have changed is, even when I first, started working for Secretary Rice at the State Department, she was actually a big believer in this, because when I was in grad school and traveling to Iran, I used to go and see her when she was, still National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State. And she was really captivated by this idea of how young people were using technology. So she was really bought into it. But the State Department and the US government more broadly, they really thought technology was more of a fad. And I would say the big transformative event was when social networks were used in 2007 to organize what at the time was the largest protest against a terrorist organization in history, against the FARC in Colombia. And then you had sort of a series of sort of examples like that, and then there was sort of this euphoric moment around what technology could do, and I would argue too euphoric. Right. Then you had the Arab Spring, WikiLeaks, and a bunch of things that said, oh, maybe we have been a little bit too, utopian and Pollyannish about what this is all going to bring. And maybe, as the world comes online, the digital world is going to reflect all the complexity and problems of the physical world. But the good news is, the vocabulary around technology people have today, which they didn't before. I think that people are cautious about dismissing new technologies as a fad or a trend in the way that they were before. So they recognize the importance. So I think that's the good news, is we don't have to convince people of its relevance. I think we have not yet figured out how to adapt our foreign policy to reflect the hybrid nature of the world. So I happen to put my cards on the table. I'm very against this idea of creating cyber this and cyber that and technology bureaus and so forth. I think it's a terrible way to think about this, because the world is multidimensional. It's filled with a bunch of geopolitical problems, and each of those problems have a physical manifestation and a technological manifestation. And if we orphan out the technology issues, then we don't approach these problems comprehensively. So if you look at, let's take the recent example of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now. Every war begins as a cyber war, and then that spills over into a physical war, and then the cyber war perpetuates, right? You could argue that, the two countries have been in a perpetual state of cyber conflict since the last time they had a physical conflict, and it's just kind of spilling over into the physical domain again. And so I don't like the way that we're organized, because I don't think it reflects how integrated the two fronts of the international system are. And as a result, we basically, try to, solve different dimensions of the same problem, as if, we're like grappling with geopolitical issues in two completely different worlds, when it's just one integrated system.
So that leads me to the next thing. So how do you see kind of the technological fluency of senior policymakers right now? I mean, you and I have had this conversation before. I mean, part of this is a generational thing, but I think if we had a nickel for every time someone said, well, I don't really go on the Facebook very much, but my grandkids are on it all the time, and it seems really important, or something like that. And there's almost, sometimes there's kind of a willful, leave that to the tech people, right? So like, I do foreign policy or national security, the tech people do the tech people. If I need them, I call them the way I call a lawyer. And yet, if you go back to some of the other moments in our history when technology issues were on the table, that would have been unthinkable. So if Henry Kissinger had walked into the Situation Room in the early 1970s in the White House and said, well, I don't know how to build a nuclear weapon or how those things work, but but I'll call in an expert. Now, he was negotiating these things. This was the stuff of geopolitical competition and of diplomacy. So it seems like there's probably a generational change. I mean, as folks are getting more comfortable, but how do you see the sort of general fluency of our national security and foreign policymakers with technology issues?
So this is one where I'm not going to complain about this, because I think that I don't have an expectation that incumbent foreign policy thinkers are overnight going to become experts on this, but I don't see a lack of effort. And I'm actually I'm realistic and pragmatic about how fast it's going to happen. I think this has been a wonderful opportunity for young people who are interested in foreign policy, because it's very hard if you're kind of, a recent graduate and kind of new on the scene. You're not likely going to describe something about the Chinese economy that people who've been looking at the Chinese economy for 20 years haven't thought of, and you're not likely to fresh out of college be able to sort of articulate some sort of grand bargain between two competitive powers. But every young person entering the foreign policy space or the public policy space coming out of a university setting is likely to know more about technology just by default than whoever they work for. And rather than having to convince the person they work for that it's relevant, a smart boss or a smart supervisor or a smart mentor will recognize that there's a real symbiotic relationship to be had. There's a lot of the ideas that I think shape geopolitics right now are ideas that rarely reside in one person's brain. So when Eric Schmidt and I wrote The New Digital Age, we had this view that we wanted to write a book that neither of us would be able to write on our own. So we spent countless hours over the course of many years trying to sort of shape ideas together based on what we both knew, and we decided that we wouldn't put an idea on paper unless it resembled something that neither of us had on our own thought of before. And I think that's kind of that's the relationship that a young person should strive for as they enter the public policy arena.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, especially for the students and soon to be thrown into the workforce who are tuning into this. And also, it's a double opportunity, one, because of what you just said, but also there's a lack of concepts in a lot of these areas. So if you were to graduate from college and say, I've got a big idea on nuclear deterrence, the chances that would not have been played with, written up, and monkeyed over for decades is small. But if you're thinking about, cyber deterrence or the illiberal or liberal nature of technology standards or the innovative uses of quantum computing, I mean, I'm just making up some of these things that there's a lot more space available because it's not sort of written in stone. All right. So, and how much of the focus on this, I guess two questions about this. One, how much of the focus is about US and China, given the heightened worries in the United States and other countries about competition with China across the board, but obviously technology is a key vector of that competition. And then on China itself, for a while there was this sort of narrative that China is good at replicating stuff, maybe it's good at perfecting technologies developed elsewhere, but it's not innovative. It's not good at innovation. It doesn't have the ecosystem there to be able to permit the sort of freedom of thought and the venture capital and all of these things to be able to produce truly innovative technologies. So I guess the first question is, how much of what you see do you think is reflective of the focus on China? And then the second question is, where's China stand in the technology stakes?
Yeah, look, this is honestly the seminal question that's going to define the next decade, and I think it's the thing that has turned, even as people became more comfortable with the idea that technology was here to stay. It wasn't until people, I would say roughly 3 to 4, maybe 5 years ago, got properly freaked out about the nature of competitiveness with China, particularly in the technology space, that the issues kind of moved to a tier 1 issue. And that's a really big deal. I mean, that's a real kind of, center of gravity shift in terms of foreign policy thinking that you really only see happen, once in a generation. I mean, it's, to me, it's, the center of gravity, that kind of anchored us around the war on terror was the predecessor to this, and then this shifted it away from that, right? So it's a really big deal that doesn't happen very often. And I think what's so striking for me about there's a few things about U.S. and China. First, I think it's fascinating how we got here because it was a bipartisan miss across multiple administrations. This is the reason we are where we are right now is not a Democratic failure. It's not a Republican failure. It's not a Bush failure, an Obama failure, or a Trump failure, or a Biden failure. It is just, we just missed it. And we missed it because we had such a first mover advantage on technology, and we just completely missed the need to formulate a coherent strategy around maintaining that first mover advantage. And China's strategy for I think part of the reason we didn't think we needed a strategy is we viewed China incorrectly as merely a nation that had a strategy of copycatting and not much more. And yeah, that's how it started, is theft of intellectual property. But as they built companies based on the foundations of stolen intellectual property, they started to train some serious talent. Like we have here in the U.S., that talent then leaves and goes and founds their own companies. They have a massive population that is hyper connected. They benefit from that hyper connectivity and hyper integrated platforms. So they're able to do things at scale that are much faster than are harder for us to do. And it's, everything is state owned or semi-state owned, which gives them an incredible ability to move, bigger, better, and faster in a lot of cases. So if you look at the current state of things right now, there's plenty of real and legitimate innovation happening in China, even if it's built on the foundation of, kind of illegitimate growth early on. And if you look at the competition, China is producing 5 times the number of software engineers at the same level and skill as the US. They're beating the US in voice recognition, facial recognition, payments, e-commerce. They have 80% of the commercial drone market. They don't just have a first mover advantage on 5G. They've basically won 5G. They have surpassed the US in quantum communications. They have either matched or slightly inched ahead of us in quantum computing. And the list can kind of go on and on. There's just not that many verticals left that they're still behind the US. And so you ask yourself the question, how did that happen, right? Especially as we've been, highly aware of this in the last 5 years, and with each, successive year, more and more aware of it. And I think that when we talk about competition with China, I think there's a missing word in there, which is it's an asymmetric competition, right? So we are competing with each other, but playing by completely different rules. So China competes in 2 capitalist systems. They compete in the capitalist system that we participate in, where it's governed by sort of certain rules and norms, and they have a whole other system that allows them, far more, flexibility in terms of how they do things. And so if it's not a fair fight, and we go head to head with them 1-to-1, the US isn't actually big enough under those circumstances to compete with China on a 1-to-1 ratio. So this gets to a lot of the things, Richard, that you and I have written about. We have no choice but to do this multilaterally, with other advanced democracies that are also leaders in technology. And we're missing the multilateral moment ahead of us right now. And there's a window where if we can't figure out how to band, advanced techno-democracies together to get big enough to level the playing field, to overcome an asymmetric competition where most of the asymmetries benefit China, then we're going to find ourselves not just losing on strategy, we will have basically ceded almost every single first mover advantage that we had. So the good news is we're still in that window. The bad news is we're still kind of feeling our way through, how to approach this multilaterally, and COVID obviously certainly has not helped.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only way, right? And like, even if you only took defense technology, which, the things that we've been writing about is about unifying democracies that have innovative tech sectors and large economies across all potential elements of collaboration. So on technical standards, on research, on everything else. But even if you only took defense technology, it's just not going to work to say the United States can only rely on the best technology developed inside the United States, and Australia can only rely on Australian technology, and the Brits can only rely on British technology, and the French on French technology. It's only by combining the best innovations across all of the allied or at least like-minded countries that we're actually going to be able to compete effectively.
And but Richard, it's also, the other thing that I would say about this, it's not all forms of technology, right? So there's plenty of technologies out there where the governance the governance model doesn't really matter that much, right? So when it comes, so we should be focused, and when we talk about critical technologies, we should be talking about, what are the capacities around which governance model matters, right? So, multilateral payments and electronic payments is a great example. Like, it matters a lot if the technology that moves our money around the world is built based on democratic principles or reflecting democratic values. Artificial intelligence, is another example. We don't want to inadvertently build, tools that help with surveillance at scale, right? So the way we have to think about this is, it's not about, just broadly speaking, technology, American technology versus Chinese technology. This is about a set of capacities that we want to reflect democratic values, because the alternative is a set of technologies that can redefine the international order to reflect illiberal values. And we don't want to end up in that situation. So I think we have to be very specific about which types of capacities, right? So it's, this is why, you have a sort of summit for democracies. This isn't about democracies for the sake of being democracies. Like, it matters if a country is a democracy, when you're talking about certain capacities.
So you're suggesting setting priorities?
No, I would never.
No, but I mean, that was flipped. But well, you and I both worked in the U.S. government. The typical thing that happens inside government is something happened. What do we do about it? Which is two separate questions, and there really need to be four questions. What happened? How important is it? What do we do about it? And what would that cost? And it's the how important of that is that, and what would it cost to tend to get left on the cutting room floor? Because if the answer is, the answer can't be China or any other country that we're in competition with did something, or the people there did something, or there's some new development, therefore we must respond. This is by definition a priority. The deciding what is important, what we're going to do about it, and how much it would cost to do something about it is sort of key to this entire endeavor. Let me go to, there's some questions that have come in from the participants here. So Tyler says that he is a Sine student associate for Congresswoman Comstock and a junior in the School of Public Affairs. His question is technology a leading factor in national conflicts? And if yes, will it continue to be the sole leading factor in national conflicts? Maybe I can extend this out just a little bit, because I think we see now that cyber attacks are a feature of every conflict, as we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, even one that hasn't even started yet. And you've thought some about deterrence and what that means in a very different way than the traditional ways of deterring war or deterring attacks. So maybe you can talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I've really struggled with this deterrence question. I view it, I basically spent an entire year determined to come up with the answer of how do you create deterrence in a world of hybrid conflict. And I very arrogantly was like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to just dedicate a ton of time to it. And the best analogy I can give you is, not that I've ever experienced what it's like to be a neuroscientist, but I have friends that run neuroscience labs. And what they always tell me is, you run the experiment 30 times and it works the first 29 times and you're excited, but then it breaks down the 30th time and the whole experiment basically needs to be thrown away. That's how I feel about deterrence in this space. Every time I thought I had it, and there were times where I really thought I had it, it breaks down in the details. And there's a few reasons for that. So it's very easy to say, oh, we'll just come up with doctrines of proportionality and, we'll measure it in terms of, a cyber attack that inflicts this level of economic damage or, leads to this, loss of life, or we'll sort of agree on which types of targets are off limits. All of that, it all sounds great, right? And then you start gaming it out beyond sort of an op-ed or even a foreign affairs article, but you go into like full-on blueprint mode, and it just doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a couple of reasons. One, let's start with attribution. So I'm pretty confident we can get a handle on the technological attribution, but attribution has two aspects of it. One, you need to attribute where the attack came from. And you can, oftentimes trace it back to the attacking entity, and sometimes that's in country, sometimes it's as a bank shot off of something else. But then there's kind of a more traditional intelli, kind of attribution, which is, defining the relationship between the attacking entity and a state apparatus to really determine, if there's a connection. That second part of attribution is really difficult. Second is measuring damage, right? So if you think about, an overwhelming cyber attack, on a country with massive intent to wreak havoc, if that country has really great defenses, and the attack doesn't really do anything, how do you kind of respond to something that has essentially been rebuffed by, it's not as like visible as, a missile flies, from Yemen, over Abu Dhabi and the Emiratis intercepted, or similar. If you go back to the, early 90s with Saddam Hussein and Scud missiles into Israel. So you don't have that aspect of it. Second is the delay, right? So oftentimes an attack happens and, a country may not even know that it's been attacked for, weeks and months. And my sort of funny way of describing this is like, imagine if, 20 years, after, Kennedy's assassination, we like learned that, Fidel Castro had been, involved in the Kennedy assassination. We're not going to like invade Cuba, 20 years later because of, that, and it shows you the power of delayed attribution. So even if you can get attribution right, it's rarely in real time. And then there's just a psychological aspect of it, right? Which is, it's hard enough to get the American voter and populace to rally behind the idea of responding to things in the physical world. Then when you start getting into like, intricate cyber things that are hard for people to necessarily get their head around, there's just not it's hard to muster political will around that. And so, so you have a political will problem. And so I'm just listing a handful, but I'm just convinced that deterrence is a dead end in this space. And so if, deterrence is a dead end in this space, then we need to come up with something else, because the answer can't be that we just kind of give up. We have not figured out how to do collective security in this space, which I think is a really worthwhile endeavor. And, you could argue that if, again, I come back to the multilateral argument, if we can figure out how to do meaningful collective security in this space, the power of multilateralism can be a deterrent in and of itself. But right now, I mean, I could rattle off a list of seriously destructive, nefarious cyber attacks that have happened, not just, against the US, but lots of other countries and entities, both in the public sector and the private sector. And it's not really clear how we've responded. And then so much of this happens in covert domains. And the problem with deterrence is it's hard to do it if you can't talk about it, right? It's hard to do deterrence without a public domain aspect of things. And so much of cyber war today happens in kind of, the dark shadows of the covert space.
Yeah, that's great. Let me go to this is Chaitanya, who is an SIS undergraduate student. Is there a world where the prominence of NFTs or cryptocurrencies takes over traditional economic practices and structures? Building on that, how does the development of metaverses and virtual realities change the conventional geopolitical norms of sovereignty and security? And does that maybe even lead to philosophical change on the idea of reality? Okay, so maybe you want to throw in what's the meaning of life as well. That's a pretty big question, but that'll give you some stuff to get started. Those are good.
So let me separate out three things in that conversation. NFTs, crypto / Web3 more broadly, and the metaverse, because I think we're talking about sort of three different things. And let me start with crypto, Web3, whatever you want to call it. So this is a space that I've spent a lot of time in. I'm a investor. I advise companies in this space. I'm keenly interested in this space, and I'll tell you why. it reminds me of what I was seeing in the information and communications technology space going back to 2004, which I was referring to in your first question, Richard, which is, I like looking at things that get trendy and asking the question, what does this remind me of? And what's really new here? And I think what's so interesting is there was such a hyperventilation and euphoria around AI for a while. I think what's interesting about AI is, as of now, it's hugely important for business. It's hugely important technologically. It's kind of infused into every aspect of technology these days. AI in and of itself has not had the seismic change on geopolitics that I think people have expected it to. It's been an accelerant for things and so forth, but it's not, and it could still be, but I actually think the Web3 space is going to have a more profound impact. And I'll tell you why. If you think about the last 20 years, the technology story has been about what types of technology from an infrastructure perspective are here to stay that move information around the world. And then what types of platforms and applications are built on top of that infrastructure. And then what are the implications of all that technology that moves information around the world. But the last 20 years has been a story of moving information around the world. And it's been a real mixed bag. There's been great aspects of it. There's been really hazardous aspects of it. Information and communications technologies are ubiquitous. And so surprise, surprise, the internet reflects all the complexities and the good and the bad of the physical world. What's interesting about what people are calling Web3, and I don't love that term because I don't think that what we're talking about here is a new version of the internet. If you're talking about blockchain technology, smart contracts, decentralized infrastructure, all this stuff, I think this is technology that is changing the way value moves around the world. It's a totally different thing. And so I think that what's happening is we're on the precipice of a new technological revolution that will basically be a successor to the internet that will coexist with it. So it's different, right? It's about movement of value, whereas the internet is about movement of information. They're not totally mutually exclusive and they'll coexist, but I really think we're talking about different things. Now, if you look at cryptocurrencies, these are things built on top of this infrastructure. The infrastructure is here to stay. So the biggest crypto opponents, people who hate crypto, and people who love crypto can agree that the infrastructure itself, like blockchain's not going anywhere. Smart contracts are going to, continue to be something that we invest in. Even decentralized infrastructure is something that we're going to continue to invest in. And people can debate, the things that happen on top of it. But in the early days of the internet, many of the things that were built on top of ICT infrastructure don't exist anymore in terms of applications and platforms and particular services. It takes a while to figure out what are the platforms and the applications that have this sort of staying power. And so it's very much TBD what that looks like. I think there's a few interesting distinctions between this space and the internet as well. When the internet, first kind of came to prominence and was really starting to spread around the world, there were a lot of organic use cases about how it was bettering people's lives. There's not as many organic use cases yet around the application of a lot of this technology that's moving value. I think that I think the difference here is a lot of that's going to be created synthetically as opposed to happening organically, at least in the near term. In terms of NFTs, I find the NFT space really interesting because to me, it's an extension of how people like to share, right? So people tend to focus on NFTs in terms of the new form of artwork. I look at NFTs as kind of a successor to social in the sense that NFTs are a way to basically access exclusive social interactions that give access to new opportunities. So you see this a lot in the investing space where somebody has to they have to buy a digital monkey NFT for $10,000 and it's really complicated to do. And there's only so many of them, and the people that know how to do it and execute on that purchase gain access to an elite community where they get access to particular types of deal flow, right? I give that just as sort of an example, but there's a really social aspect to the NFT space, which I think is really interesting. And then the metaverse is also interesting. So you look at virtual reality, it's not a huge consumer base. I think the applications are, I think there's lots of great applications for gaming. I think one of the really interesting applications for VR is end of life, right? So if you look at Japan, Japan has a really rich ecosystem of robotics for caring for the elderly. I think that you'll see some really interesting innovations in the VR space that helps kind of bring joy and memory to people in that last chapter of life. And then there's some other use cases and so forth. But I just don't envision billions of people sitting around with headsets on. I think augmented reality seems much more plausible to me than at scale than virtual reality. I think people just don't want to wear that thing on their head. I went through a phase where I was walking a virtual dog at night and it would like overheat my face, and I decided I was over it.
I was playing Oculus, and they have these things where you can do jobs. You can work in a store. And I was like, but I have a job. So the idea of going home and then putting on the Oculus to in turn pretend like I'm doing another job was odd. And then so I started playing a shooting game, and at one point though I went to put my hand down on the non-existent block and fell over. So it does take some practice.
Well, there's one other application. So at Jigsaw, we actually spent a number of years. So the way we work at Jigsaw is we always everything starts with an experiment. So and we do two types of experiments. We do technical experiments based on a technological theory of change, and then we do behavioral experiments based on a behavioral theory of change. And when we sort of have a match between the two types of experiments, that's when we decide to build. So in our case, we had a number of engineers who were really interested in this question of, can you integrate machine intelligence into virtual reality, which hadn't really been done. And they experimented with that. And then, we, just because of the events that were happening in the country, we had some of our researchers on the behavioral side asking the question about, is there something we can do around law enforcement, particularly related to de-escalation training? We ended up marrying the two experimental efforts, and we built a tool called Trainer that uses, it integrates machine intelligence into VR. It's a responsive VR system meant to train law enforcement around de-escalation. So the way it works is the police officer puts the headset on. They go into one of 6 different scenarios, and the person of interest responds differently depending on the language they use, the tone of their voice, the volume of their voice, physical proximity to the person of interest, how they interact with certain objects. It's not meant to replace training. It's meant to be kind of a supplement to it. And we sort of positioned it less as a product and more as a research project. And we ended up graduating it to 4 different universities to kind of study it further. And the reason for that is we think it's an open question about whether some of this can be used for training. And the reason we chose law enforcement is it's kind of the ultimate test as to whether or not the training can work. And so, there's lots of easy examples of little consequence where you can experiment with training, but there's no point in really sort of making a play for, a training use case for VR unless you can do it in a context that matters. So the 4 universities are going to kind of study this further, but it's a meaningful technological milestone that they reach to kind of cross a believability threshold where police departments will actually experiment with this, as part of their training.
What do you think about crypto as an anti-corruption and accountability tool? So, the theory of the case would be if you have a publicly available distributed ledger and you know where the value goes and who's got it, then it makes it a lot harder to hide money and things like that. And people even talked about that given the humanitarian catastrophe that is currently unfolding in Afghanistan. So you've got 20 million people that are, in acute danger of malnourishment. All the liquidity is dried up. The banks don't have any money, and the liquidity, civil servants aren't getting paid. The Taliban now runs the government, obviously, and so the Afghan reserves are frozen in banks abroad. So the question is, well, how do you get assistance, including potentially money assistance, to be able to help people that would otherwise be starving or hurting without that money going to the Taliban? Is there a blockchain possibility, leaving aside the underdeveloped nature of technology infrastructure in Afghanistan, they still did play around with mobile payments for the army and things like that. So there's some. So would that be a potential use case?
Yeah. So this is where I think it's important to distinguish between, crypto and, and the type of infrastructure on top of which crypto is built. So I like to think of things in terms of, the problems that we're trying to solve for. So the problem of, and also what this technology creates. So like, for instance, if you look at what is the main value of blockchain? It creates immutable ledgers, immutable distributed ledgers. So you ask yourself the question, is there value in that? There's tons of value in that, right? Like indelible, evidence of human rights violations, property rights, the use case that you're describing with. So then there's inefficiencies in how the global financial system works, right? The inability to send instantaneous payments, real-time settlements, FX marketplace. I mean, you sort of
transaction
costs. Yeah, there's tons of there, and it always hurts the most impoverished, right? And look no further than remittances, right? But so the idea of that to me is not controversial, and those are all problems to be solved. Then there's a question of are cryptocurrencies the right way to do it? And again, it's not a monolithic thing. There's 90,000 plus things that sort of describe themselves as cryptocurrencies, right? And they're all very, very different, and they range from, highly unregulated, crypto assets with no intention of ever being regulated to ones that are really trying to be as integrated in the global financial system as possible. So I think the problem that you have with most things that would sort of describe themselves as cryptocurrency is ease of use. The ease of use is just really hard, right? And so, a lot of the adoption of crypto falls in two categories. People who have the resources, the time, and the wherewithal to sort of figure it out. But I always tell people, go through the experience of downloading a digital wallet, buying cryptocurrency, validating that you have it, making sure you're not getting hosed on fees, making sure that you have your 2 pages of passwords that you don't like. It's a complicated thing. And by the way, you're also entirely reliant on a stable internet connection, right? Which in a place like Afghanistan they don't really have. And so you have the ease of use problem, you have the connectivity problem. I've been spending a lot of time looking at are there other ways to do this? For instance, I've been looking a lot at gold. So gold is a better store of value than cash, but it has none of the functionality of cash. So in the commodity space, a lot of you can basically give commodities that are a good store of value the functionality of cash by digitizing, fractionalizing it, and using a private blockchain to authenticate it. You can do that on things like Hyperledger and so forth. So there's other ways to solve the problem of instantaneous payments, transaction costs, and so forth with existing assets that are already out there. That leverage the same type of underlying, technological infrastructure that is used by cryptocurrencies.
There's a question from Thomas Kenna, recent graduate of American University, now working at the Reagan Institute. Hey, Thomas. How should the United States prepare for and/or respond to a potential scenario in which one of our adversaries, like China, employs disinformation and deepfake technology during a future military operation, such as an invasion of Taiwan?
That's a great question, Thomas. I think that you have to assume that's happening already. Maybe not in that exact context, but the way you sort of have to subscribe to this is, or the way I always subscribe to it is, if I can think of it, our adversaries can think of it. I have no illusions that I'm, some sort of creative genius that has sort of thought of the use case that, if I say out loud, I'll introduce an idea that our adversaries haven't contemplated. I think on China and Taiwan, what's so interesting is we've been rehearsing for these scenarios that are kind of traditional military conflicts between China and Taiwan as long as I've been alive. The worst kept secret is that we lose every single war game that we do. And that's before you calculate how little Americans care about what happens between mainland China and Taiwan, if they care at all. And then, but the thing that's happened, I think, in the last, several years, and Richard and I did a war game together that kind of teased this out a little bit is maybe we're training for the wrong type of conflict. That the most, obviously there's the political and historical reasons why China cares about Taiwan, but the best insight I ever got into how the Chinese Communist Party thinks comes from a Chinese economist friend of mine. She said, she said, what you have to understand about China, is nobody expects their government to be honest, but they expect their economy to grow. And if the economy, doesn't grow at the pace that people expect it to, people start asking questions, and the cage gets rattled and so forth. And she said there's just two Achilles heels that that Beijing has. One is if people can't physically breathe because the pollution is so bad or the water is so polluted, and two is if the economy stops growing. And so urbanization takes care of some of that, but there's only so much urbanization that you can do. So they have to constantly think about ways to grow the economy. And the one area technologically that China continues to struggle with is semiconductors. They've pumped tens of billions of dollars into their own semiconductor, and they just can't get anything that looks close to chip parity with Taiwan. And this has been explained to me. And by the way, in the US, we struggle with this as well to get chip parity with what we see coming out of TSMC in Taiwan. And it's been explained to me several times. And I think I just haven't spent enough time in Taiwan to really understand this enough to properly digest it. But it has something to do with multi-generational human capital in Taiwan that just can't be replicated anywhere else. And people who've spent more time there can explain it and comprehend it better than I can. But I think you just have to take as an assumption that at least in the short term, Taiwan possesses a capability that is better than either the US or China. And so, if you sort of fast forward and a few things are true. One, the semiconductor space is only going to get more important. Two, China is only going to grow more and more frustrated by its inability to get parity with TSMC. And so they're going to look across the strait and they're going to see that there's this thing that's right there that they want that nobody can stop them from taking. And so you ask yourself the question, what does it look like if China just decides they want TSMC? I don't think it's a military conflict. I don't think it's an annexation of the island. I think it's something much more subtle and gradual that is a combination of undermining Taiwan, politically pressuring Taiwan, and forcing them to make an uncomfortable choice or set of choices. And so I think so Thomas, I think to your question, you're looking at the right place and you're zeroing in on the right sort of genre of subspace within the sort of China-Taiwan question. And I think that I don't know if we'll see a military conflict between China and Taiwan in the next 5 years. I feel fairly confident that the semiconductor aspirations that we see coming out of Beijing will certainly turn the temperature way up on that region.
All right, there's another question from Isa. China has expanded its economic relations with several countries, so several states have dependency on China. Do you think a multilateral consensus can be reached on, quote, containing China? Thank you. This may be a T12 opportunity rolled into your lap to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I'm really worried about the current state of multilateralism. And so I think the short answer to your excellent question, Isa, is we can't contain anything without doing it multilaterally. I think that the area where there is the most potential, and I think it's less about containment, because I don't really buy the Cold War analogy, right? China is a very fast-growing economy. In addition to their, the Chinese Communist Party representing one of America's most formidable adversaries. They're either the first or second biggest trading partner for the U.S. I think their motives are more economic than ideological, so I think I think it's more about. I think the concept here is something around asymmetric competition more than containment. We need to find a way, as I mentioned earlier, to level the playing field. So an asymmetric competition looks more like a regular competition, so that we have a real shot at competitive coexistence that disproportionately benefits the democratic world. And my concern is I was already worried about this before COVID. And I think if you look at the democratic world's response during COVID, there's been some bright spots, but it's not exactly represented. The last 2 years has not exactly represented the heyday of multilateralism in the democratic world. And I think it comes down to, I think that, we need, and I don't think even on China, I think you don't have a lot of consensus within the democratic world on this. China has actually become a really, dividing issue within Europe. It's become a dividing issue in the transatlantic relationship, and it's hard to rally the democratic, countries together around competing with China when they view their relationship with China in oftentimes in very different ways than we do. So I think that represents the challenge. It doesn't answer your question, Isa, other than to say that I think your question is spot on. Neither Richard nor I are in government right now, so nobody really cares about our opinions. But I think this is one where the U.S. it doesn't happen without U.S. leadership. I think U.S. leadership and convening power still matters. And my biggest concern is you have the Quad, you have all these sort of cute multilateral architectures, and it's not clear to me how they all work together. And sometimes they seem like consolation prizes to countries that were left out of the previous architecture. And I think there needs to be a much more kind of coherent strategy on this.
Let's talk in our last few minutes about a couple of technologies and things that we haven't gotten to yet. So one thing that's much debated in national security circles is the potential of quantum computing to crack public key encryption, which of course is how all is the basic way of encrypting information, including all the classified information that could otherwise be read by adversaries. What do you think is the sort of potential of quantum computing in the national security world? And then you might also say something about quantum communications, which is supposed to be, in a way, the flip side of this, sort of uninterceptable communications, because it doesn't travel. The information doesn't actually travel between 2 points, so there's nothing to intercept.
Yeah, so I think they often get conflated together, and they're really different. So on quantum computing, so a few thoughts. We're still really far away from real world applications of quantum computing. It's still very much in early research stage, and it can be confusing because you'll see headlines like quantum supremacy reached and this and that, and that all that means is a certain milestone with many more milestones that are still highly speculative ahead before we get to real world applications. But it's important to invest in. I think that it requires two things, or really three things: human capital, actual financial capital, and teams. And there's probably only about 5,000, maybe 5,000 plus software engineers around the world who really are kind of like tier one, engineers, who have like mastery of quantum computing. And those engineers want to work on teams, right? Quantum computing is not something that you like do in a garage, or you do as an individual contributor. It requires like, big teams, expensive infrastructure, big facilities, right? It's a lot of cold computers. It's just not something you can do on your own. I think it's a really interesting opportunity for the U.S. because you could imagine, one idea I've sort of always had on this is you could imagine a situation where you say, we want to keep those talented software engineers because they're such precious resources. We want to give them free immigration movement and special visas to be able to operate anywhere within these facilities and at specific companies that specialize in quantum computing, as long as it exists within country, these sort of democratic countries. So you can imagine sort of finding clever ways to keep the human capital contained within the parts of the world that are trying to build quantum computers in ways that are consistent with democratic values. I think quantum communications is a little bit more advanced, and look, the incentives are really there for people to have more secure communications. You see this at the individual application level, and you certainly see it at a larger level. And China's I wouldn't say they're far ahead, but they're definitely ahead in quantum communications.
Okay, so we got a lot of students who are tuning in and will be tuning in for this. So, what are the areas that in technology, at the intersection of technology, national security, technology, and foreign policy, that you would suggest people focus on? And then also, how important is it a technical background to have a job like yours, like the job that you have now, or the job that you had in government? So, do you need to go out and become a software engineer and then become a policymaker, or is it better to achieve some base level of technical fluency so that you understand conceptually some of the things we've been talking about today, but really it's about preparation for a policy career in the traditional fashion? What's your advice to folks who are interested in this area?
Look, I'll make a larger point about this, which is I always tell people, don't do things because of what you think it will enable you to do later. Do things because you're interested in it and it directly relates to a set of capacities you need in order to do what you want to do now. So get a PhD if you want to be a tenure track professor. Go to law school if you want to be a lawyer. Go to medical school if you want to be a doctor. Learn how to code. If you want to be learn how to seriously code if you want to be a software engineer, or learn how to lightly code if you're curious. Don't learn how to code because you think you need to do this in order to do A, B, and C later on. I just think that's it's a hazardous way to pursue your careers. I've always subscribed to the following approach, and I think it's worked out for me, which is I kind of look at my life as a portfolio of things that I'm curious about. So I wake up in the morning every day, my life, and I sort of ask, what am I curious about? And I make sure that my portfolio of curiosities is hedged in ways that reflect all the things that I'm interested in. So I lean into tech in ways that kind of properly represent my curiosities and interests in tech. I lean into presidential history in the same way. I lean into geopolitics in the same way, and I just don't waste time learning things that I don't want to learn, and that I don't need in order to do the things that I'm curious about. So instincts are pretty powerful, and curiosity is your best North Star. And I don't mean that to sound cliche, but nothing pains me more than when somebody says to me, I'm learning this and this, and I ask them why they're doing it, and they said, well, in order to get this job 40 years from now, or in order to be governor by the age of 40, or in order to be CEO of a major tech company one day, I need to do it. And what I'm interested in is, what do you want to do right now? And I encourage you, don't plan it all out, because the best career opportunities I've had have always come from my lack of planning. Uncertainty is the best gateway into options. And if you plan it all out with sort of boxes and flowcharts, you're not going to allow any kind of uncertainty or randomness in your life. And that's where all the opportunities come from. So just don't try to plan your whole careers. Plan, how to maximize what you're doing now. And I really urge you not to do things unless you're genuinely curious about them.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice. I mean, so often I'll talk to young people who seems like the most common piece of advice they get in Washington, D.C. anyway is, imagine where you want to be in 10 years from now, and then the steps that are likeliest to lead you there. And then you start marching up that ladder. And that sounds like a recipe for misery, because, who knows what happens in 10 years? You never get to the top of the ladder. You get hit by a bus on ladder 9 or the rung 9. I mean, if you can have intrinsically fulfilling experiences one after the other, then that itself is the summation of a fulfilling career. So, but speaking of curiosity that doesn't necessarily have any, shall we say, practical value, you are, as I mentioned, a collector of presidential hair. So before we let you go, the last two questions, I guess. One, why the hell do you collect presidential hair? I mean, you could make mailboxes or birdhouses. You could collect mailboxes from around the country, stamps, coins. There's a lot of other options, but presidential hair. And then two, if you just did a cursory review of our national currency, it would look like Andrew Jackson probably has the best mane of any. George Washington, probably give him a run for the money. But how would you handicap the top 3 or 4 presidential hairdos from the late 1770s until the present?
Oh, great question. So first of all, I collect presidential artifacts and memorabilia writ large. So, signed documents and letters from every single president going back to George Washington. I love relics. So, that's everything from John Adams, champagne glass that he had in the White House to the vial of poison that James Garfield's assassin's sister sent to him in prison to, a sleeve from Lincoln's shirt that I'm bidding on right now from the night of his assassination. The hair happened kind of by accident. One of the leading authenticators and greatest authorities on provenance of presidential memorabilia is just coincidentally the largest owner of historic hair in the world. And he started, the hair market has emerged rather recently. And I'll give you a very funny article that you can Richard, that my comms team told me is a manifestation of what happens when the CEO goes rogue. But he started throwing hair in when I would buy, really nice presidential letters and so forth from him. And there wasn't really much of a market. And it's now my best performing asset in any portfolio that I have. There's a massive market. It's not why I do it, but there's a massive sort of hair market. Now I look at it sort of like, Bitcoin. You can have a lot of it, but somebody needs to be willing to buy it. So there's not a lot of people in this space, but I have a beautiful George Washington lock of hair and Andrew Jackson lock of hair. And before people think it's super weird, nobody thinks asking for an autograph is weird. And this is basically until the early 1900s, people didn't ask for autographs. They would ask for a lock of hair. So a lot of the provenance around this stuff is tied to the you can sort of DNA test the hair. You can DNA test the wax that the hair was used that was used to attach the hair to the letter. You can test the age of the paper, and you can actually achieve provenance pretty effectively. But it's a super weird hobby, but you kind of have to own it.
Okay, and the top hairdos.
I've always thought that if somebody could get their hands on Martin Van Buren's mutton chops, that would be a real coup. I've never seen it on the private market, and I don't anticipate that I will. But Van Buren and Chester Arthur, people just don't do that anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that great note, we are at our hour. So thank you, Jared Cohen, for joining us and sharing your wisdom on all things technology and presidential hair and everything else in between. Thanks, everybody, for joining us from American University and beyond. And our next session, we're going to take a 1 week. We've been doing these weekly, but there'll be a week break. We are rescheduling a session with Representative Mike Gallagher, but our next one will be on February 15th at 4 p.m. with Tom Donilon, who will talk about the role of the National Security Council and his old job, the National Security Advisor, in the making of foreign policy. So tune in for that. And Jared, thank you again.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Bye.